Hi, I'm Christian Ledford again, introducing as part of the Locke and Lewis lecture series, Ben Edwards. Ben Edwards is pastor of discipleship at Inner City Baptist Church and serves as academic dean and instructor in pastoral theology at Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. Ben received his MA from Northland International University, his MDiv from Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. He is currently a PhD student in world religions with a full minor in Christian philosophy at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Today, Ben is going to be giving a talk entitled Christianity and Myth.
Thanks, Christian. The idea of Christianity and myth. Really what that idea is pointing to is the relatively common view that Christianity is just a myth. Perhaps you've talked with someone who thinks that way. Perhaps you have interacted with people who would say that there is a myth of Christianity. And really, I think there's two reasons why people tend to describe Christianity as a myth in that way. The first is because they're trying to say that Christianity is really not distinct from any other religions out there. It's just like every other religious idea, every other religious teaching. And then connected to that is to be able to say that Christianity is not the unique revelation from God. My goal today is not necessarily to make a case that Christianity is a unique revelation of God or that the Bible is a unique revelation of God, although I do believe that's true. My goal is twofold. First, to demonstrate that the Bible is not myth. The Bible is distinct from myth. And secondly, to say that the Bible is historical in nature. And so to begin with that, what we're going to do is we're going to consider what myth is. And really for the first half of my talk today, I'm really utilizing the book by John Oswalt, The Bible Among the Myths, and really tracing his discussion through that, supplementing with some examples along the way. So as we consider the question of what is myth, we could have what we could call an essential definition. Essential definition is a definition that is getting at the core of what something is and then trying to define it in that way. Some examples, not exact quotes, but the basic idea of what people mean when they say myth. One would be a false legend about gods. This is probably one of the more common understandings when we think about the Greek myths or things like that. We're saying they're not true, it didn't really happen, it's about God, so it's a false legend about gods. Another common way of understanding this is to say it's a way of explaining natural causes or natural events with supernatural causes. So looking at the world around us and saying what's happening here is actually because something outside of this world is happening. Or perhaps what's becoming a bit more common in our day is that you have religious stories believed to be true. Because in the past, people would think about the belief system of tribal peoples in some kind of location, and they would look at that and think, well, they were kind of backwards people. That was kind of a pre-scientific era, and so obviously that was kind of below that, but we've really moved to a more of a relativistic idea, and so now we can't look at what the people think and say that that's somehow backwards, and so this is, in theory, a more neutral kind of position, which a religious story, and people think it's true. Whether or not it's true, we don't know. People think it's true. But there's two broad problems with these essential definitions. The first is just the fact that they are too broad, that they end up covering a lot of things that actually aren't that similar. The example Oswalt gives, it would be like saying a table is something that has 4 legs, and you say, well, an elephant also has 4 legs, so does that make it a table? And we say, well, no, they're not the same thing, and so our definition isn't actually narrowing in quite as much as it needs to. And the second is that most of these definitions actually kind of already have an evaluation coming into them. The idea that it's a false legend. We're already assuming, well, it can't be true because it's a myth. And so because it tends to kind of assume it's not true, I don't think it's most helpful to consider the essential definitions of myths, which leads to a second kind of definition, a more functional or descriptive definition. And in this, what we do is we look and say, well, what kinds of things are usually included in myths? What tends to characterize myths? And here we point to just 4 broad characterizations, and then we'll look more specifically and in depth at some of these characterizations. The first is that nature is given a personality, that the wind, the sun, the moon, these kinds of things take on more personal realities. The second is that they are designed to explain the world. They're designed to explain reality. It's looking at where the world is now and trying to say, well, how did it get here? And so one of the examples that I've came across is from a Native American legend about the beginning of the world. The idea was that the maker of the world made everyone, and then was talking to one of the first women and said, so if I throw this rock into the lake, will this rock float? The woman says, well, I think it will float. And so the maker says, well, how about let's do this? If I throw the rock into the lake and it floats, then you'll never die. And if I throw the rock into the lake and it doesn't float, then you're all going to die. And the woman said, well, that sounds fair to me. And so he throws the rock into the lake. It doesn't float. And so that's why everyone dies. And what's happening there is the looking and saying everyone dies. So why does this happen? Well, this is why. It's providing an explanation for reality. A third common characteristic is to provide order or security in a chaotic world. That people recognize this world often seems out of control. And so these myths are actually ways of people beginning to say we can exert some type of control. We can provide some kind of order to this world. And then the final is that these myths focus on the ideal or primeval world. That these are not things that happen in history. You don't have with these myths timestamps. It doesn't say in the such and such year of this king or in this time period. It's more like the fairy tale, well, once upon a time. There's no real connection to actual history because these events actually usually don't happen in history. So with these broad characteristics in mind, let's focus a bit more specifically on some more characteristics of myth and then of the Bible and see, are they the same or are they actually different? So we begin by discussing characteristics of myth. And the central characteristic is what I would say is oneism. That's a term actually coined by Peter Jones. What it means is that in the end, ultimately everything is one. There's a continuity. There's something that really ties everything together so that we can't ultimately divide them. The historical term for this is monism. But people hear monism and they think, is someone in pain? What's going on? What does that word mean? And so what Peter Jones did was said, well, let's take off the M and basically put it in a way that we can understand it. Oneism. Everything is ultimately one. So another term that you might be somewhat familiar with is the idea of pantheism. Pantheism is really monism or oneism connected with theism. There's a God and everything's ultimately one, so everything is God. Everything is ultimately God. That's the idea of pantheism. And you really have 3 broad realms in this idea that are all ultimately connected together. You have the divine realm, the supernatural realm, you have nature, and you have humanity, and they're all blurred together into one. You've probably experienced maybe a small example of this if you've ever heard someone talk about their spirit animal. The idea is that there's some kind of connection between you and this creature, this animal. There's this spiritual connection where there's a unity ultimately between the two. This is really the idea that's flowing out of this. And so the example I give you there is really of Hindu idols. If you ever go into a Hindu temple, you'll see next to the altar where the god is, there's a little bell. Because each morning you have to go and you have to wake up the god. And so you ring the bell next to the idol. And the idol has this connection to the god. And so you wake up the idol, you feed the idol. If there's flies, you fan flies off of the idol because the idol and the god are ultimately connected to each other. So the primary characteristic is this idea of oneism, this idea of ultimate continuity. What are some other characteristics? Second is the actualization of timeless reality. That you have ritual acts that are really reenacting what happens in nature or among the gods. that humans are doing things that have happened in other realms, and in doing them, you are actually causing them to occur again. And so here I have a quote from Bruce Waltke. Through the recitation of the handed-down myth and the performance of the ritual, the priest, who is often a king, magically manipulates something, a force of nature, to repeat itself according to the original creative event. And these often are the idea that something happened before time began, and then you are reenacting that reality. So I think one of the clearest examples, one that you might have some familiarity with, is the sacrificial ritual system of the Aztecs. The Aztecs believed that the beginning of the world was actually caused when the sun god killed a man, and through his blood used that power then to create the world. And so the sun actually receives its power from the life force that is found in humans. And in order to keep the world from falling into chaos, which is what we see here in the quote I have up there, the chaos is that, convinced in order to avoid the final cataclysm, it was necessary to fortify the sun. They undertook for themselves the mission of furnishing it with vital energy, found only in the precious liquid which keeps man alive. Sacrifice and ceremonial warfare, which was the principal manner of obtaining victims for the sacrificial rites, were their central activities, the very core of their personal, social, military, religious, and national life. That they had to save the world. They had to recognize, if we want the world not to fall back into the chaos it once was in, we've got to make sure that the gods continue to have life, which means we've got to reenact the original foundation of the world, which was the death of a human. And so therefore, they did the death of humans over and over and over again. Another characteristic is the denial of boundaries. Things like incest, things like bestiality, things like homosexuality were not forbidden in this kind of perspective. Because with incest, you're saying there's something that defines your family that's different from other people. And then in continuity, you don't have these kinds of boundaries. What really separates humans from animals? What really separates men from women? There's this removal of these boundaries that you have, which, for what it's worth, often people will say that the reason the Bible condemns these kinds of things is because the Bible is just kind of backward and prudish, when a lot of cultures had no problem with these realities, because they didn't believe that there were actually distinctions between these things, and so therefore they were encouraged. Another common characteristic is polytheism, that you have a multiplicity of gods. There's not one overarching god or one true god. You have several gods, because there are multiple forces in the natural world, so there must be multiple forces in the divine world. You also have the use of images. We mentioned this already with the Hindu idols, but you have these artifacts, these images that were connected to the actual gods. And we mentioned there's three realms. You have the divine realm, you have the natural realm, and you have the human realm. And in these images, you often combine the three because they're shaped to look somewhat like humans, but they're typically made out of natural materials that then connect you to the divine. And so all three of these things are merging together in these images. You have the eternality of chaotic matter, that these myths land on the idea of what was at the beginning, and the answer was matter was at the beginning, that this universe has always existed, but it existed in this chaotic form. There was no order. And so what ended up happening is the gods had to bring some kind of order to the chaos. Now, I mentioned earlier that these myths tend to give some personality to nature, but it's not strong personality. There actually is a minimization of human or divine personality with a slight raise of personality of nature. And so in these myths, you really have flat characters. The gods of these myths are not complex beings. This is the god that's always mad, or this is the god that always tries to bring messages. And so they just have one kind of aspect of who they are. There's a minimization of personality because personalities are what tends to separate things. This makes you distinct or unique, but there's not uniqueness. There's continuity between all of these. You also have a very low view of the gods. If you've read things like the Roman or Greek myths, you realize these gods are petty, these gods are jealous. In fact, these gods are pretty much like what we are. That we are fighting all the time, and so they're fighting all the time. And really, conflict is at the very heart of this idea of life. The conflict is essential to life, that the world actually came through conflict. Here I have 3 points brought up by Bruce Waltke in discussing this idea that conflict is essential to life. He's saying these are the 3 parts that are really part of every mythical creation story. The first is a repressive monster, often a serpent, restrains the earth mound and contains within itself the potential existence of all things. Then a heroic god, born out of the restraining monster, vanquishes the monster, so releases from her the forces essential for life, and the hero god brings the forces under his control and organizes them into a cosmos. Now, we'll come back to this, but if you've read Genesis 1 and 2, you think that doesn't sound at all like what the Bible says about where the world came from. And just like there's a low view of God, there's also a very low view of humanity. In fact, some of these myths say that humans were really created to be food for the gods. That the gods had no real purpose for the humans other than for their own sport, for their own pleasure, their own desire. And human choices tend to have very minimal effects. These mythical stories tend to be rather deterministic. It's just fate. And the gods are deciding these things, and in some ways you're just left to the whims of the gods. And because there is this emphasis on continuity, individuality, again, is lost. And so what makes humans distinct from everything else is not there. They're just like every other part of the world. Then you also have no single standard of ethics. You have a multiplicity of gods, but there's no overarching moral order. That it's essentially you decide, I'm going to follow a particular god. And if I follow that particular god, then that god will take care of me and protect me. And so I pick a god, and then I decide I'm going to do this. And really the same thing's true for governments. That kings don't have any kind of order that's imposed upon them. Kings just decide, well, this is what we're going to do because this is what's going to work in society. And then finally, there's the cyclical concept of existence. That because the world has always existed, the world has gone through multiple cycles of chaos, then to order, and then back to chaos, and then back to order. And it's not really moving forward, it's just continually moving backwards. And so you have this idea of an endless cycle of events. Those are some major characteristics of myths. What are some major characteristics of the Bible? Well, we said the central characteristics of myths is oneism. The central characteristic of the Bible is, again, using the term from Peter Jones, twoism. That in the Bible, what you have is in the beginning, not eternal matter, not chaos, but in the beginning, you have God. And then God creates everything else. And so in the idea of the Bible, you have 2 distinct realities, God and creation. And these 2 are separate from each other. If you have any familiarity with this Bible, you might be aware of Isaiah 6, where Isaiah sees God on his throne. And he sees these incredible angelic beings who are surrounding his throne. And what these angelic creatures are crying out is, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. Now, we tend to think of holy as the idea of being morally pure. But really, the essence of the idea of holiness is unique, set apart. And so what they're saying is, no one and nothing is like God. God is unique. God is set apart from everything else. That's at the very core of the biblical teaching. Some other major characteristics of the Bible, then, are monotheism. That the Bible is very clear throughout, there's only one God. In fact, there's really only three monotheistic faiths in the world today: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And all of them claim to be built off of the kind of ideas you find in the Old Testament, because what we find there is different from all the other religions. That the Bible was unique in saying there really is one God. Now, the Jews sometimes failed to recognize that. The Jews sometimes acted as if there were more than one God, acted as if there were other gods. But the Bible consistently points that out as error. There really is only one God. Another characteristic, then, is the idea of iconoclasm. That unlike in the myths, the God of the Bible explicitly says, "Do not associate me with the creation." The second commandment that God gives to the Israelites on Mount Sinai is don't make any kind of image. And yet, what we see when Aaron makes the golden calf, that what he's doing is he's actually not saying, "Hey, Israel, here's another God for us to worship. Let me make you this calf so we can worship another God." In fact, what he says after he makes the golden calf and it comes out of the fire, he says, "Behold the God who brought you out of Egypt." What he's doing is he's associating this calf with the true and living God. And God is furious, because God says, "You can't associate me with something here in this world. Therefore, you cannot make any graven image." And that God is eternal. That the universe is not eternal. The universe has not always existed. God has always existed. And creation is not something that comes out of conflict. You don't have some kind of major fight that ultimately ends in the death of something that then brings life to everything else. And the scriptures, all you have is God speaking. It's purely an act of his will. That God speaks and then things are made. And you have a very high view of humanity. That man alone is made in the image of God. That there's something different about humanity. That man is the pinnacle of God's creation and is therefore the crowning act, because man alone is made in God's image and man is set up as God's co-ruler over the earth. You also have a higher view of God, because you don't have a God who's bound by whims. You have a very reliable and faithful God, a God who always acts in accordance with his character. And sex is desacralized. In the mythical kind of realm, sex is actually a very common way of gaining favor of the gods, or certainly of gaining fertility. Again, if you have some familiarity with the Bible, you probably are aware of the Baal cults. It's the most common kind of cult that the Israelites fell into. And in the Baal cult, it was the idea of these are the ways that you can get good produce, that your crops can be plentiful in this land. What needs to happen is you need to have sex with a temple priestess, that will then somehow inspire the gods to have sexual relationships, which will then affect nature and bring you good produce. And so sex is a sacred act. But in the Bible, sex is not a sacred act. Sex is not a religious act. Sex is a familial act. It's an act between a husband and a wife designed to help create offspring in order to spread around the world, to fill the earth, and to subdue it. You also have the importance of ethical obedience as a religious response. That you do have an order, a moral order that is imposed on people. There's an overarching ethic. In fact, the king can't just decide for himself what he's supposed to do. The king is supposed to do what God says everyone is supposed to do. That this order falls upon everyone. And then you also have a strong importance on human historical activity. That whereas with myths, the whole point is kind of things that are happening before time began or outside of time, but in the Bible, the focus is continually on what is actually happening in time. And so I have first of all here a quote from James Barr, professor of Hebrew at Oxford University in the middle 1900s. He said this: "It will probably be agreed that the importance of history in the Israelite mind was the greatest factor in enforcing the differences from the mythological environment. It is thus perhaps possible to say that the central position in Israelite thought is occupied by history rather than myth. Read the Bible and you see very clearly the focus is not on things happening outside of time, but things happening inside of time. And so Bruce Waltke says this: only the biblical writers present God as acting according to a consistent trajectory of salvation history, which in the German is Hausgeschichte. The salvation history from the creation to the eschaton. Then in the biblical perspective, we don't have this endless cycle. We actually have a beginning, and history is moving toward an end. That one day, everything will be consummated in exactly the way that God intends for it to be. And so to me, as I look at how we understand myth, and then how we understand the Bible, they're the exact opposite. That there might be some superficial similarities. That yes, both of them are talking about supernatural things. Both of them do have some connection to what's happening in history, but the way that connection's happening, their understanding of those things are very different. Because one at the very core has continuity. The other at its very core has transcendence. That the God is above the rest of creation. Now before we transition fully then to saying, so the Bible is not myth, is it history? I want to just take a brief aside and address something that you're likely to encounter. So far, most of the focus has been at looking at the Old Testament and comparing it to ancient myths. Probably one of the most common approaches in our day is to compare Jesus specifically to Greek or Egyptian myths. And I want to begin by essentially saying I'm going to push pretty hard back against that idea. And the reason is because that idea really has no basis in anyone who knows what they're talking about. I know that sounds harsh, but someone who's coming along and saying, well, the idea of Jesus, the teaching about Jesus, what Christians believed about Jesus is actually all stolen from Greek and pagan myths, is someone who really doesn't know what they're talking about. Because that idea has been out of the scholarly consensus for decades. And so here I give a quote from Craig Evans. Craig here is writing in 1993, so 25 years ago, and he's talking about the scholarly consensus among people who are talking about the historical Jesus. You may have heard before the idea of the quest for the historical Jesus. This is what he's saying. He says, I think it is fair to say that the earlier and later phases of the quest of the historical Jesus interacted with essentially the same agenda, that of myth. So the earlier agenda was at the beginning of this. And so this is often called the early quest. This was the kind of thinking that began in the late 1800s through the early 1900s. And so people then were saying, well, if we're going to get to the historical Jesus, we've got to understand Jesus in light of these Greek myths. Then there actually was a period of time where they said, well, let's not care about whether or not there is a historical Jesus. Let's just focus on what the Bible says about him. And so we went from what's called early quest to no quest, and then it moved back to what's called later quest, and that's where he's saying the later phases, or sorry, the new quest. And in this, they went again to saying, well, let's look back at these Greek myths. But really, middle of the 1900s on, they began to say, you know, the Jews in Palestine didn't really interact with Greek mythology. They didn't pay attention to it. And there's not a lot of parallels between the teaching about Jesus found in the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Greek myth, but there is a lot of parallels to Jewish thought. And so if we're going to understand who Jesus was, let's not focus on Greek mythology, let's focus on Jewish thought at the time, which seems to make sense to me. What they did then is they said, well, the idea of myth just doesn't make any sense. And so if you're someone who knows what you're talking about, you say, why would I look at the Greek myths to figure out who Jesus is? And that's exactly what Craig Evans is pointing out. Today, however, this is no longer the case. Myth has ceased to be an item of importance. And so that's why I think in part Philip Jenkins, professor of history, Baylor, says this in a blog post he wrote about the myth of the mythical Jesus. He says, briefly, if you are discussing Jesus of Nazareth, you can make any argument you choose to offer. If you wish, you can deny or challenge pretty much any aspect of the story told in the Gospels and present Jesus or his contemporaries in the most sinister or demeaning light possible. We can then argue about the evidence offered for any particular point. What you can't do, though, without venturing into the far swamps of extreme crankery, is to argue that Jesus never existed. The Christ myth hypothesis is not scholarship and is not taken seriously in respectable academic debate. The grounds advanced for the hypothesis are worthless. The authors proposing such opinions might be competent, decent, honest individuals, but the views they present are demonstrably wrong. And just to help you understand that, I'm going to point to some of the supposed parallels between Jesus and these myths. And what we'll see is there really aren't parallels. That often people say, well, Christians believe Jesus was born of a virgin, but that's because of all these other Greek gods or Egyptian gods or pagan gods who were born of a virgin. But here's a summary quote from an article by Mary Jo Sharp. It is the story of Jesus borrowed from pagan myths. The idea of virgin birth. Well, Mithras is born out of a rock on the banks of a river under a sacred fig tree. Adonis is born out of a myrrh tree. Dionysus is produced from an incestuous relationship between the god Zeus and his daughter Persephone. Osiris is the product of an affair between an earth god and a sky goddess, and while Osiris and Isis are fetuses within the womb of the sky goddess, they have intercourse and produce Horus. On the other hand, Jesus was born from a human female virgin, being fully God and fully man. Now you look at all those other accounts, and what you find is none of them are virgin births. What they are miraculous births. And so people are really playing with terms. They're saying, well, the idea of Jesus being born of a virgin is just like all these other things. And all they're really saying is, well, other people in mythology had miraculous births. But what the Bible claims and what historic Christianity claims is not just Jesus' birth was miraculous. It's that Jesus' birth was from a human female virgin. And there's nothing else like that in the pagan myths. The second area where many people point to is the idea of Jesus' death. But again, what we actually find is that none of the death accounts of the mythological gods contain an actual sacrifice, giving oneself up for the sake of others. Adonis is torn to pieces while hunting by his arch-rival Ares, who takes the form of a wild boar. Osiris is coaxed by his brother into laying in a sarcophagus, which is shut and locked, then set adrift on the Nile. Some accounts state that Osiris drowned, others say he suffocated. Dionysus is attacked while admiring himself in a mirror. He took many shapes to avoid his attackers and was cut to pieces when he took the form of a bull. Mithras has no recorded death. An inscription found in Rome touted Mithras as the invincible sun god. He was one of the favorite gods of the Roman military, most likely because they wanted to be ever victorious like him. And so again, really what you have is you have people saying, well, Jesus was killed, and so were these other people. But again, the Bible doesn't just say Jesus was killed. A lot of people were killed. They say Jesus sacrificed his own life. That Jesus said, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. And he does so, he says, to ransom many. That I give my life as a ransom for many. You don't see that in any of these accounts. Yes, they both died. Yes, someone killed them. But that's it. There's not really parallels. Now, what about the idea of a resurrection? Many people also say, well, there's other resurrection stories. Well, let's look at these resurrection stories. There is no known account of Mithras' death, so there's no resurrection story. Osiris, pieced back together by Isis, was revived by the incantations of several gods, including Thoth, who came and performed spells over him. He is brought back to life as king of the dead, thus living in the underworld, Sekep Tepep. So his resurrection occurs in the land of the dead, and there he remains as king of the dead. At least 5 different stories are given about Dionysus. His mother pieced him together after his being cut to pieces. He ascended to heaven after death. Zeus raised him up. Zeus swallowed his heart. His heart was made into a potion and given to Semele, and she then gave birth to a new Dionysus. It is also recorded that Dionysus died and went to reside in the underworld for 6 months, then was raised to the upper world for the other half of the year, and this continues to occur every year. And the reason why that someone would think that way is what we talked about earlier with myths. There you have this cycle of life and death. And so why do we have crops half the year or not half the year or these kinds of realities? Well, it's because these gods are doing things like this. The reasons given for this cycle include its phenomenological explanation of the crop cycles, and also that Dionysus spends half of the year with Persephone, the goddess of the dead, the other half with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, because the two women are both in love with him. Now, what you don't have is the biblical teaching about a resurrection from the dead that occurs for Jesus. That Jesus doesn't become alive in some kind of realm of the dead or lives in someone else. That Jesus' resurrection is a resurrection of a glorious body that then will never die. And I think one of the strongest understandings to show that this was unique is actually Paul's sermon in Acts 17. As Paul's in Athens, standing on Mars Hill, he's talking about what he believes. And all of these philosophers are there listening to him. And they're happy to listen to him until he says that Jesus was raised from the dead. And as soon as he said that, the people didn't say, oh yeah, we know that. We have a whole bunch of gods who also were raised from the dead. They say, Paul, you're crazy. Stuff like that doesn't happen, Paul. Now that would make no sense if Paul's teaching is the same thing that so many other people taught. Paul was saying something different. The resurrection of Jesus was not something that was found in these other sources. Which leads then to the final quote I give you here from William Lane Craig. And just to understand what's being said, let me give you the context. Someone's written into him, and they said, I talk with people, and they keep saying, well, you just believe in Jesus in the same way that all these other people believed in these pagan myths. You're just believing these pagan myths. And so I began to try to explain how they're not the same when the person says, boy, you're working really hard to try to save your religion. And you think, well, which is it? Am I just supposed to blindly accept that these teachings about Jesus come from pagan myths, or should I actually consider whether or not they are, and then in so doing, act as if I'm trying to save my religion? How do I work with this? And so William Lane Craig says this to this person. When they say that Christian beliefs about Jesus are derived from pagan mythology, I think you should laugh. Then look at them with wide eyes and with a big grin and exclaim, do you really believe that? Act as though you've just met a flat earther or a Roswell conspirator. You could say something like, man, those old theories have been dead for over 100 years. Where are you getting this stuff? Tell them this is just sensationalist junk, not serious scholarship. If they persist, then ask them to show you the actual passages narrating the supposed parallel. They're the ones who are swimming against the scholarly consensus. So make them work hard to save their religion. I think you'll find they've never even read the primary sources. So yes, you have popular skeptics who would say, oh, well, the teaching about Jesus is just borrowed from pagan myth. And one of the things you need to say in response is, you honestly don't know what you're talking about. Because anyone who knows what they're talking about knows better. So, the Bible I don't think is myth. Jesus, the teaching about Jesus was not taken from pagan mythology. But is the Bible historical? And to answer that question, really to begin to answer that question, I just want to focus in on the historicity of the Gospels. And the first 3 points I'm going to give are taken from Tim Keller's book, The Reason for God. And the fourth is taken from the book that I think Keller's actually basing a lot of his stuff off of, which is the book by Richard Bauckham, The Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony. So, are the Gospels historical? I'd say, first of all, that they're not legend. The Gospels are not legend because the timing is far too early for the Gospels to be legend. The canonical Gospels, the ones in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were all written within 40 to 60 years of Jesus' death. Most people think John was the latest, maybe written in the 90s. The others written sometime in the 60s to 70s. Now, you have people who date them later, but there's a large group of scholars who've wrestled with this for a long time and said, it makes most sense to put them in this kind of a time frame. But even before you have the Gospels being written, you actually have the letters of Paul. Some of these letters were written within maybe 15, 25 years after Jesus' death. And Paul's talking about the same things as the Gospels. And so what you have then is you actually have eyewitnesses of Jesus' death and of the resurrection that are circulating at this time. In Mark 15:21, it says, the man who helped Jesus carry his cross was the father of Alexander and Rufus. You say, well, who were Alexander and Rufus? The answer is, well, we don't really know. So why does Mark mention them? And I think the most likely explanation is this. The church, people Mark's writing to, they knew Alexander and Rufus because they were part of the church. They could go up and say, that was your dad? And they can say, yeah, he told us about that. Or potentially even, maybe we were there watching. But they had these eyewitness accounts going on. I think Paul does something similar in 1 Corinthians 15 when he says Jesus was buried and then he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And then he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. And after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living. Now why mention that? Because Paul's in a sense saying, you can go ask them. They're still here. You can go talk to people and say, did you see Jesus? And they'll say, yeah. And so these accounts are written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, which means you couldn't go around saying, Jesus died, because people would come and say, no, he didn't. He's right over there. You couldn't go around saying, Jesus rose from the dead. People would say, no, there's his tomb. There's his body. There were people who opposed Christianity from the very beginning. You know what none of them said? None of them said, who are you talking about Jesus? This guy Jesus never lived. Because they all knew he lived. They never said, what do you mean Jesus died? Jesus never died. Because they all knew he died. They didn't say, look, there's his body in the tomb. Because they all knew the tomb was empty. And so these accounts are written far too early for them to actually be accounts that were legend. Which is why Paul in Acts 26 could say this, the king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. This was well-known facts about the life, death, and the empty tomb about Jesus. So the content's far too early. Secondly, the content is far too counterproductive. What a lot of people say is that the Gospels were actually written later on by Christians who are creating events in the life of Jesus in order to provide teaching and answer questions that they were wrestling with. But if they were written to promote and support the leadership of the early Christians, what Keller points out is we would expect to see many places in the Gospels where Jesus takes sides in debates that were going on in the early church. But that's not what we see. I think the clearest example is this. The biggest debate, the earliest debate that happened among the church was the question of, do Gentiles need to be circumcised? And so they actually have a group of Christians at the Church of Jerusalem. They all get together and they try to hash out, what do we need to do about this? Now, if Christians were in the habit of saying, here's a controversy, you know what would be great? If Jesus told us what to do about this. So let's create a story where Jesus gives us some kind of teaching, so then we can come and say, well, Jesus said this. But you know what Jesus never addresses? Whether or not Gentiles should be circumcised. Now, why are there no stories about that? I think it's because the disciples didn't decide they could make up stories about Jesus. They weren't creating stories. They actually were just recording the events that happened. Further, why would the early church make up the cross? When anyone would assume that meant Jesus was a criminal. If you're trying to get a following, why would you say, hey, did you hear about this guy who was just executed as a government criminal, as someone who was opposed to the Roman government. Hey, this guy was just executed. Let's all follow him. I mean, why wouldn't you instead say, hey, maybe Jesus looked like he died on the cross, but actually he was just taken up to heaven? Or some other kind of reality. You wouldn't make up the idea of a cross. Why would you create Jesus asking if it were possible to avoid the cross in the Garden of Gethsemane? I mean, if he's going to die, at least let him go as like this bold, proud martyr. And yet all the Gospels have Jesus sweating great drops of blood, crying out all night, God, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. It's the exact opposite of the way that you would try to portray someone unless you were just being accurate. Why would they invent women as the first witnesses to the resurrection when the testimony of women was not admissible in court in that society? That if you're trying to figure something out, you can't have a woman come and say, well, this is what happened, because she wasn't allowed to testify. And so why would you say, who were the first people who saw Jesus after he rose from the dead? Women. I mean, why not pick Nicodemus? He's one of the Pharisees. Why not Josephus? Why not someone who'd be respected? Because they didn't decide who was the first to see Jesus. It just happened that way. Why constantly depict the apostles in the worst possible light? I noticed this first when I was really looking through the Gospel of Mark. Some of you may be aware that most people believe Mark was written primarily based off the teachings of Peter and his teaching about Jesus and their life and ministry. And you read through Mark, and one of the things that becomes very clear is Peter and the other apostles are idiots. It's like they're not getting what Jesus says. They're constantly fighting with each other. They're not understanding what's going on. And if you're trying to say, hey, we're the authoritative leaders of this new movement, why would you portray yourself as buffoons? Wouldn't you portray yourself as the people who say, we got it before anyone else got it? We really understood what was going on. But they didn't do that. Why? Because they didn't feel the right to change the history of what actually happened. Now, there are other Gospels that actually do this. The Gnostic Gospels. The Gnostic Gospels are constantly having Jesus address issues that the community is talking about. The Gnostic Gospels are portraying the apostles as heroes, but not the canonical Gospels. Third, the canonical Gospels are too detailed to be legend. This is from C.S. Lewis, really a world-renowned literary scholar. I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, and myths all my life. I know what they're like. I know none of them are like this. Of this, the gospel text, there are only two possible views. Either this is reportage. It's just people looking at history and what happened. Or some unknown ancient writer without known predecessors or successors suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic, realistic narrative. We're used to reading narrative and getting all these details. We're used to hearing someone, they slowly opened the door as it creaked, and they tiptoed into the room and immediately felt the hot blast against their face. And this is what we expect in our narrative fiction. This didn't happen until the modern era. And so what Lewis is saying is, if this is what someone made up, then you had someone who made it up, and then no one else followed that same kind of practice for 1,000 years, and no one did it before that. Or it's just what people were reporting because it's what they actually saw. So some examples of this. In Mark 4, we're told Jesus was asleep on a cushion in the stern of a boat. You say, well, why did they include that? Well, I think it's maybe because you have Peter going down into the boat and he's in the middle of this storm and he's terrified. He's a veteran fisherman. And yet he's thinking, we're going to die. And he goes in and he sees Jesus asleep. And that's the kind of thing that's just going to stick in your mind. He's just sleeping there in this pillow. That's the kind of thing that sticks in eyewitness minds. In John 21, we're told Peter was 100 yards out in the water. when he saw Jesus on the beach. He then jumped out of the boat, and together they caught 153 fish. And this is one of my favorites because there was a lot of debate in the history of the church of why is it 153 fish? And so some people would say, well, there's 12 fish for each of the 12 apostles, and there's 6 for the number of man, and there's an extra 3 for the Trinity. That's how we get to 153. You know what I think? John said there was 153 fish because he'd never caught that many fish before. That was his record. He was like, that one time we had never caught that many fish before. I've never caught that many fish again. There was 153 fish there. That was amazing. So he remembered that number because it stuck in his mind. In John 8, as Jesus listened to the men who caught a woman in adultery, we're told he doodled with his finger in the dust. We're never told what he was writing or why he did it. None of these details are relevant to the plot or character development at all. The only explanation for why an ancient writer would mention the cushion, the 153 fish, the doodling in the dust, is because the details had been retained in the eyewitness memory. The fourth and final reason is really pointing to the historical nature of the gospel witness accounts is the names that are found in them. And this to me is fascinating. This is from Richard Bach and Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And he's pointed to the fact that people have done studies now. And what they've done is they've looked at census and reports and things like that from Palestine, and they've compiled a list of names of people in Palestine at that time. And I think the most common 2 names for men in Palestine in Jesus' day were Simon and Joseph. You look through the Gospels, you know what the most common 2 names are in the canonical Gospels? Simon and Joseph. So this is what he says. The names of Palestinian Jews in the Gospels and Acts coincide very closely with the names of the general population of Jewish Palestine in this period, but not to the names of Jews in the diaspora. So what he's saying there is we have accounts of the names of people who actually lived in Palestine, and we also have accounts of Jews who lived in Alexandria and in Rome and other places, people who were spread around. And I think those names are something like Sabbaticus and basically like a form of Lazarus were the most common names. They appear once in the Gospels and Acts. And so the names of the Gospels and of Acts match up very well with the names of people we know who were living in that period in that time. One of the reasons I think this is fascinating is because names to me are one of the things I remember the least. I can often remember, this is what he looked like, this is where we were, this is what he said, this is what that person was wearing. But names are hard to remember because there's no real connection to anything. And as hard as it is to remember names, imagine trying to peg the top names of people who lived in Detroit 100 years ago. I have a real hard time doing that. I'd even a harder time of pegging the top 100 names of people who lived in Ireland 100 years ago without actually looking at a bunch of historical records. So if I were to just create legends, I would pick names that most likely would either match where I'm living now or where I used to, or some other reality. But in the Gospels, we don't. We have the names actually matching with the people at that time. So back to the quote. In this light, it becomes very unlikely that the names in the Gospels are late accretions to the traditions outside Palestine. The appropriate names simply could not have been chosen. Even within Palestine, it would be very surprising if random accretions of names to this or that tradition would fit the actual patterns of names in the general population. And what he's saying is this. If people 50, 60, 80, 90, 100 years later were making up accounts, they wouldn't get the names right. And again, we can compare this because in the Gnostic Gospels, which were all written about 100 years later, and often were written in other places, outside of the names of the actual 12 apostles, their names don't match up. And so this is, again, evidence that this was written by people in that time period who actually saw these events. And so therefore they knew these people. They knew their names. And why does history matter? Well, I think history matters to Christianity more than it does to any other religion. I won't take time to really flesh that out necessarily, other than at this point in time to point to the importance of history to Christianity. Because you read through the Bible and it matters, did God make the world? It matters, did God actually make promises to Abraham and then to Isaac and to Jacob? Did God actually bring out the nation of Israel from the land of Egypt in the Exodus? And the Bible account over and over again points to, how do you know God's faithful? Look at what he did. The Bible emphasizes over and over again the importance of the incarnation. That it matters whether or not Jesus actually was God who became man. That without that, there is no Christianity. You could take Buddhism out of Buddha. You could take Buddha out of Buddhism. It still exists. You could take Confucius out of Confucianism. It's still going to be okay. You can't take Jesus out of Christianity. Whether or not he died matters, and whether or not he rose again matters. That there is this importance placed on history. And so if the historical events of Christianity are not true, Christianity is meaningless. And that's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. Or Peter, in 2 Peter 1 says, we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. And over again, the Bible is saying, we're not concerned with myths. We're concerned with the God of history, who interacts with this world and then entered into this world and died and rose again in time, in history. I want to conclude then by considering more broadly, why should you even care? Really, what difference does it make whether or not Christianity is a myth? I want to say, first of all, broadly, it matters because it affects our understanding of reality. And let me just highlight three aspects of that. The first is in the area of human rights. That in human rights, what has to be true is that you are an individual who is distinct from other people, and you have certain rights that these other individuals who are distinct from you need to observe and not trample and not violate. But in the realm of myths, there's no distinction. There's no individuality. That you aren't an individual, therefore you can have no individual rights. And then if you listen to Christian in the talk before this, I think he pointed out that really without God, there's no basis for morality or human rights anyway. That the reason that we think people deserve something is because we think people are distinct from the rest of this world, and that they alone are made in the image of God. And therefore they have certain rights. And we must treat these people with dignity and respect. Which flows really then into the second question of ethics. That if there's no being outside of this world, then there is no one who can impose a moral standard on everyone. And so in the realm of myths, we're basically left with, you can do whatever you want as long as you can get away with it. And yet if there's a God, then morality is sourced in him. Then third, the area of logic. If you've ever studied logic, you know one of the key, really the key aspect of logic is the law of non-contradiction. That something can't be both true and not true at the same time. And really what that flows out of is the hard distinction that God is not creation. There is a distinction between the two. But in oneism, in monism, in this realm in which everything is ultimately one, things can be true and not true at the same time. Things can be good and evil, which really means there is no foundation for logic in this realm. Where did logic come from? Logic came from the understanding of the Bible. There's a God, and he is distinct from everything else. And so it affects our understanding of reality, but it also affects our understanding of the Bible. Because some people would come along and say, well, who cares if it's myth as long as you believe it to be true? Who cares if Jesus actually ever lived? Who cared if Jesus actually died, if he ever rose from the dead? What matters is if you believe that. What matters is the spiritual truth that it points to. And I think, as we already noticed that the Scripture would point to, the Bible would say, well, if the Bible got this history wrong, who cares about its spiritual teaching? If these things aren't true, it doesn't help us to believe them. So we need to understand the Bible's not describing myth. The Bible's describing history. Finally, this all matters because this ultimately affects our eternal destiny. That it affects our understanding of the nature of salvation. That salvation's not the means of losing ourselves into the greater reality of everything, or the idea that we become a drop of water that's then dropped into the ocean and then just kind of joined in this great reality and we lose our distinctiveness. But salvation is actually the restoring of the original created order. So that what God actually does is He makes us more ourselves than we ever were. And this is what C.S. Lewis points out in the Screwtape Letters. Now I have the quote up there. Let me explain what's being said so you understand what's going on. In the Screwtape Letters, Lewis is writing as if he's found letters from a demon who's writing to another demon about how to tempt this human and how to pull this human away from God. And so what he's saying is really the opposite of what is good and true, if that makes sense. So with that in mind, here's what he says. Of course, I know that the enemy, which in this situation is God, also wants to detach men from themselves, but in a different way. Remember always that he really likes the little vermin, sets an absurd value on the distinctness of every one of them. When he talks of losing their selves, he only means abandoning the clamor of self-will. Once they've done that, he really gives them back all their personality and boasts, I'm afraid sincerely, that when they are wholly his, they will be more themselves than ever. The final reality of how this affects our understanding of salvation is it affects our understanding of the means of salvation. So why is it that only Christianity has, only these monotheistic religions have a transcendent God? Why is it that so much of the world believes in oneism? And I think Paul points to the answer in Romans 1:25. We don't want a God like that. So therefore we exchange the truth about God for a lie and worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. Why? Because if there is a God who is above us, there's a God we're responsible to. And if he's really separate from us, that means we can't control him. In this one-ism kind of perspective, in this idea of continuity, you have gods that you can manipulate. You have gods that you can control. You can do things to bring them into your favor. You can do things that they want you to do because they need you to do certain things, and you can benefit them. And therefore, they'll benefit you. And so it's the idea of I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, and we can both get what we want. But in the Bible, Paul points out in Acts 17 that the God who made heaven and earth and everything in them doesn't live in a temple made by human hands, nor is he served by anything, as if he needed anything, because he's the one who gives life and breath to everything. That you can't come and bring to the biblical God anything that he needs. And so therefore you can't control him. You can't barter with him. You can't manipulate him. And that's a terrifying thought. Because we also know in our hearts there is a moral order that this God has laid down. And we've not kept it. We have broken the laws of this God. And we're ultimately helpless. But the good news of the Bible, and really what we celebrate this week, is that even though we could not do anything, God did everything for us. That he sent Jesus, and then Jesus died to pay the penalty for our sins because we could never do it. And that he demonstrated that he paid that penalty because he rose again from the dead. And so now God offers us salvation, not as a trade, but as a gift. The gift that we could never earn, but a gift that he graciously offers to anyone who would believe in his Son. Thank you.